Hi there. A week and a half or so ago, I showed you how to prevent bets being drip fed into the market during the halftime interval. Now that's working perfectly, but I've since discovered a couple of issues that I'd like to flag up here. Now this video might actually stretch on a little bit, so you might want to pause it, go and put the kettle on, make a cup of tea. I'll have milk and 1 sugar, please. And if you're sitting comfortably, we'll get started. So the demonstration I showed you was this. Just to quickly recap, the first rule here drip feeds bets into the market. So it starts in the first half. Once half time comes along, it stops doing that, and then the second half kicks off and it resumes the process of drip feeding those bets in. And it does that by relying on the number of executions of this rule here, check for half time. Now what that does is it starts off at the 45-minute point and it just monitors the market to see if the halftime match odds market has been closed by Betfair. And if it's closed, it gets executed, but there's actually no action. There's nothing happens with this rule. All it's doing is monitoring that condition, and if that condition is true, it gets executed once. And because it gets executed once, that means that this statement here is no longer true. So these back bets stop going into the market. Now to initiate the back bets going into the market in the second half, we need another rule which resets that counter, that execution counter. So it relies on this condition here, time since the start of the second half is equal to or greater than 0 minutes. So the second half kicks off. This rule kicks in and executes that action where it resets the counter, which is now sitting at 1, back to 0, which makes this statement true again, and consequently this rule kicks off and starts firing the bets back into the market during the second half period. Also, this rule has a window in which it operates so that it stops operating at the 60-minute mark, i.e. essentially the end of the interval. And the reason for that is that when this rule resets it back to 0, if you didn't tell the rule to stop monitoring the market, it would detect that the halftime match odds market is still closed, which it would be obviously. And so it just sets itself back to 1, and that would cause the back bets to go in. So by setting up a little window for this rule to operate, that allows the back bets to carry on operating during the second half. So anyway, that's how it works, and it works perfectly. However, I've since discovered a couple of things. First of all, this statement here, this condition, time since the start of the second half, relies on a live score feed being present. You'll notice I've had a bit of a whoopsie in that Jamaica game. No idea how Brazil didn't manage to score. So anyway, this condition is dependent on one of these live feeds being present. Now, during my testing of Jacob's Ladder, a lot of the matches I've been going to are obscure matches on the other side of the world. Some of the teams I've never heard of. And there's been a couple of games where there has been no live feed present. And when that's the case, when it comes time for this rule to run, that condition produces an error, and it simply says that the data feed cannot be found, which means that this rule doesn't fire. So consequently, that doesn't get reset to 0, which then of course stops the back bets going in the second half. So that's the first issue. So if there's no live feed, or if there's something wrong with that live feed, this option here won't work. Whilst on the subject, I've also had confirmation from Binteko that these statements here, market football, fixed score, number of goals, relative score, second half time, they also rely on the live score feed. So you might want to take that into account. I've already shown you a method of determining the number of goals by using the over-under markets as linked to markets and determining if they are closed or not, which essentially confirms a goal has been scored. So you might want to keep that in mind. Now there is a way of essentially eliminating the use of this, so you don't actually need a live score. And it's a case of changing some of the settings in here and having that loop round twice and so on. I'm not going to show you that in actual fact, because there's been another issue that occurred in the Argentina-Sweden game. You may have seen a post I did earlier on with a screenshot where Betfair didn't close the half-time match odds market. They left it suspended, which meant that this check for half-time issue hadn't flagged up that the half-time market was closed. Therefore, this conditional statement here was still true. So the back bets carried on being fed into the market during the half-time period. Now that potentially had cause for other issues later on in my routine, but that was essentially the main problem. And they didn't close the half-time match odds market until the second half was underway. So in the end, I manually traded out of that match just after the goal was scored, around 60 minutes or so. The only thing it would have affected was a potential redding up process if there hadn't been any goal come 75-ish minutes. So instead, rather than showing you how to correct just for this option, I'm going to show you how to do another method that would effectively cover both. In other words, it doesn't use a live feed and it doesn't rely on Betfair pressing the closed button for the half-time market. Now I'm going to make this up as I go along, so forgive me if I stop and stutter a bit, but essentially what it's going to do is it's going to set up a mechanism whereby we essentially count the time that's gone since the market went in play. And we're going to set that up and effectively give an estimate of when we think the half-time market is likely to end, i.e. the end of the first half, and an estimate of when the second half starts. Because, of course, we know how long each half is and we know how long the interval is. And the only caveat to that, of course, is we don't know how much injury time is added at the end of the first half. And we don't know how good their timekeeping is in terms of coming back out for the second half. Although generally speaking, it's fairly good because it's all reliant on TV revenue and all this sort of nonsense. So let's first of all set up a rule that will run the counter. Now, the only thing that we've got as a baseline is the start of the match, when it goes in play. So we actually have to set up a rule that will do just that. It will start when the match goes in play. So we're just going to set this up to give it some sort of description that's meaningful. So we're doing a counter for estimating end of first half, start of second. That'll do. So we're going to get this kicking off right at the beginning of the match. Now the condition for that is going to be, in fact, strictly speaking, we don't need any, but you might want to include as a matter of caution the market in play. So let's just make sure that the market has indeed gone in play. The action, there isn't any. You don't need any action. You can if you want to, but there's no need to have any action in here. Now the important bit they need is this. We're going to do an execution count. So this is going to action every certain number of minutes that we specify, and the counter, the execution counter, will just carry on counting. So what we actually need this rule to do is to carry on a certain number of counts. So what we need to do is to work out how long. So we know the first half is 45 minutes. So you might think, right, okay, we need 9 counts. Well, that's in fact, we're going to go more than that. We need to go to some time that will be just at the start of the second half. So we need to go not just from the beginning up to the 45-minute period, we also need it to go from there up to roughly where the start of the second half will be. So we're going to have 45 plus a 15-minute interval to give us 60, but you also might want to add on another 5 on there to give us a little bit of leeway for any injury time at the beginning, or so at the end of the first half, I should say. So that's going to be 65 divided by 5. Okay, so that's going to be 13. So we actually need it to count up to 13. Or do we? Think of a fence. If you have one fence panel, you need 2 fence posts. 2 fence panels, you'll need 3 fence posts. Now this counter will go to 1 as soon as this rule starts, which is going to be at 0 time. So in our little fence analogy, we have got fence panels that are 5 minutes long. So we actually need an extra fence panel. So we need this to count to 14. That's assuming I'm going to do 5-minute intervals. You can, of course, change the intervals. And if you change the interval, you'll need to change the number of executions that you want this rule to go. Okay, so that's the main function of this particular rule. It sets up a counter that's simply going to go from 1 all the way up to 14, and we're going to utilize that as part of our process to stop bits going in. Now I'll keep these ones intact, so let me just copy things down a little bit. And I'll just edit this and change it. So we'll give this version 2, just so that it's different. So in this particular case, what we want to do is the bits are going to go in as long as the counter is less than 10. In other words, after the 45-minute point, there will be no back bets fed into the market. So if we go to the conditions, I can get rid of that, since that belongs to the first 3. And what we're going to do is check the counter for this. So we need rule number of executions, counter for estimating end of first half and start of second, and that needs to be less than or equal to 10. And as long as that's the case, those back bets will be fed into the market. And of course, that will go to 11 at the 50th minute point, at which point there will be no further back bets placed into the market. Now here comes the trick. We need to do a reset counter just like this one. So again, let me just copy that, paste it down to save me setting it all up again. Reset the halftime counter, we'll call that version 2 as well. And in this case, what you want to do is probably set it to the 60-minute mark. You don't need to stop it. It only goes once. It doesn't matter if you stop it or not, give it 5 minutes. And what this is going to do is it's going to reset this counter here. So we need to reset rule number of executions, and the counter or rule is going to be that one. So we want to reset that back to 0. And the condition that we want, if we remove that one, is we want this counter here. It's going to carry on counting past through the halftime interval. Yes? So we want to set this up so that we've got 45 minutes plus 15 minutes, which gives us 60. And we want to add that in here. So it's going to be rule number of executions, counter, and we need this to be equal to 60, what's going to be 12, 13, yeah, we've got that's configuring at 10, isn't it? That's configuring, yeah, that's going at 10, so we need another 15 minutes added on to that. So I would be tempted to add another 20 minutes on, so there's another 4 in there, so you want that to be equal to 14. The reason being is it helps to take into account any issues with regard to, sorry, that should be 14, any issues regarding to injury time or any delays with them coming out of the tunnel for the start of the second half. So you're effectively giving yourself 20 minutes, give or take. So if we set that to 14. So what will happen in this case? Our bets will be entered into the market as we like, because this statement here won't be true. But in the meantime, right from the beginning of the match, this thing here starts incrementing once every 5 minutes until such times as it reaches 10. At which point this will stop submitting back bets. In the meantime, this carries on every 5 minutes, incrementing still further until such times as it reaches 14. And once it's reached 14, this rule here will reset that count back to 0, which then of course causes this rule to fire up again. Now you can, even though this is reset, and you'll notice I haven't got a stop option in here like I do up on this one, I can leave that counting because it's going to count from 0 again and essentially count every 5 minutes into the second half. And you can then use that count for something else. For example, you might want to trade out, irrespective of your position, you might want to trade out 25, 30 minutes into the second half. You can use another rule to do that, which references that count. So essentially, this rule here is doing 2 counts. It's doing a count for the first half and the interval, and it's doing a count for the second half and any extra time left. And that's it. And doing it this way doesn't require a live score feed, and it doesn't require Betfair to close the half-time market, which means that you don't actually need to monitor the half-time market. So you can remove one of those linked markets. So I'm going to implement this in Jacob's Ladder for subsequent matches, and we'll see how we get on. But that's how you go about doing it, keeping in mind that you can argue that it's not as accurate as this method because this is dependent on confirmation that it's half-time by Betfair confirming or closing the half-time match odds market and this thing here. But because the live score feed, from what I've seen, can be a little bit unreliable, and as we know, Betfair staff, when they're pushing buttons, can be somewhat erratic at times. Although I've only seen that issue once with them not closing the half-time market. And again, those issues I think will tend to only occur in matches that are relatively obscure predominantly. And so from that point of view, you might not be too bothered. But certainly this mechanism here essentially removes some of the dependency on those other data feeds and so on. Okay, I hope that's clear to everybody. Obviously, if there's any questions, let me know. And I'll leave this up for you for a little bit because I know you all like to screenshot them. Okay, guys, thanks very much. I'll speak to you later.